Hi everyone, I'm James, and my final project explores the connection between trauma-informed education and Indigenous language revitalization efforts. I'd like to provide some context as to why this was of interest to me. I've worked for about 10 years at a therapeutic day school in behavioral support, so much of my professional life has involved trauma-informed education. I train a staff of nearly 300 people on person-centered, trauma-informed interventions, and as I worked through this course, I noticed that many of the core principles of trauma-informed care already exist in Indigenous learning systems, including Alaska Native education practices. That realization led me to this question: how does language revitalization and Indigenous teaching reflect trauma-informed education, and what can we learn from it? To start, I want to briefly introduce a framework called the Circle of Courage. This model is used widely in youth development and trauma-informed education, as well as my annual staff trainings. It's based on Lakota teachings and broader Indigenous values, and this is the most obvious tie trauma-informed care has to Indigenous values. It has 4 pillars that you can see split up there, those pillars being belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. These pillars represent what young people need to thrive within themselves and within their communities. What I like to emphasize when discussing this in an educational setting is that this is not a behavior management system or a punishment system based on compliance. It's a relational framework that encourages educators to focus on connection first and correction later. Because sometimes if the connection is strong enough, the correction isn't even necessary. So before even talking about language, there's already a shared foundation that learning begins with relationships, safety, and respect. Language itself is often treated as just communication, but in Indigenous communities, language is much more than that. Authors like Dementi, Leonard, and Gilmore show that language revitalization projects rebuild identity, social belonging, and emotional safety just as much as vocabulary. They explain that language learning reconnects people to cultural memory, family knowledge, humor, and worldview. Similarly, Feenup Riordan describes learning from elders not as a lesson or a task, but as a relationship, something built through patience, practice, respect, and shared experience. From a trauma-informed perspective, this is powerful because healing happens through connection, and language is a tool to restore that connection. In the case of Alaska Native communities, these damaged connections were caused by colonization and assimilation policies. So speaking the same language isn't just technical, it's emotional. When we compare Indigenous teaching methods with trauma-informed strategies, the overlap becomes even stronger. Henze and Davis talk about authenticity and identity in Indigenous education and explain that learning happens best when the learning environment reflects the student's cultural reality. Engelbrandt and colleagues emphasize culturally rooted teaching approaches that prioritize storytelling, observation, community participation, and shared meaning. This is drastically different from the compliance and performance-based pressure of the modern education system. These approaches mirror trauma-informed guidelines by focusing on the fact that there is no learning without emotional regulation, no participation without a sense of safety, and no growth without belonging. So instead of viewing trauma-informed care as a new educational innovation, we can recognize that Indigenous communities have been practicing this form of education for generations. I want to reconnect this topic to a broader point about how we think about trauma-informed care itself. In education, trauma-informed approaches are often treated like something we bring in after there's a problem, almost like an emergency response strategy. But when we compare trauma-informed principles to indigenous approaches to learning, it becomes clear that they work best when they are the foundation for learning and not just a backup plan. Tuck reminds us to avoid defining communities only through the harm caused to them. The same caution applies to trauma-informed education. If we only use it when something goes wrong or when a student is visibly struggling, then we unintentionally reinforce the idea that relational learning is something extra and not something essential. Indigenous language revitalization shows a different model. Reviving language isn't just a response to historical trauma, it's a return to relationship, identity, and cultural continuity. Seen this way, trauma-informed care aligns with Indigenous learning because both prioritize belonging first and both understand that safety, trust, and connection are not interventions, they are conditions that make learning possible. So instead of viewing trauma-informed care as something reserved for special education or crisis settings, we can view it in the way Indigenous education already does, as a normal human-centered way of teaching. So when we put everything together, language revitalization rebuilds belonging, identity, and emotional security, which are the same foundations that trauma-informed practice relies on to support individuals. And trauma-informed education, when done well, mirrors Indigenous teaching values: relationship before instruction, community before performance, patience before correction. So instead of seeing these as two separate fields, we can see them as deeply connected conversations about how humans learn, heal, and thrive. Long story short, a large part of trauma-informed care simply repackages what Indigenous communities, including Alaska Native communities, have already been doing. I personally believe that we cannot fully implement a true person-centered approach without the effort to preserve and revitalize the cultures they come from. Thank you so much.